Do you want to know how to create realistic artwork with very minimal supplies that doesn't cost the earth? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how to do just that. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. So I'm only using minimal supplies for this one. I've got a Derwent Graphic in 2B, and you can use whichever brand of graphite pencil you have, just sort of a medium tone like a 2B or a 3B. And then I have this mechanical pencil, it's just a generic one that I use a 4B lead in. And I find that with these leads that go in the mechanical pencil, they don't come in very dark shades, but the 4B is actually quite dark in comparison to a 4B graphite pencil. And then I have a Faber-Castell Polychromos black coloured pencil, and you can use whatever brand of coloured pencil you like as well, but the black coloured pencil is a lot darker than most of the other graphite pencils that you can find. So it's a really easy way of getting your dark shades in when you're working with graphite. Then I'm also going to use a blending stump like this one, and if you don't have one of these, you can actually just use a cotton tip, which I do quite often as well. They work pretty much the same. And then I've just got a standard eraser. This one is a black eraser, but you can use whatever eraser you have. So I've started out by transferring the outline using transfer paper, and you can just draw it with a graphite pencil if you prefer. And then I erased most of my lines so it's not too harsh, but I've left just enough so you can actually see where the outline is. I'm starting out by going in the darkest areas with the black Polychromos coloured pencil. When you're using a coloured pencil with graphite, just remember that they don't work exactly the same. The coloured pencil won't blend out as smoothly as the graphite does, so just keep that in mind when you're laying down the pencil, that you want to make sure that you're following the direction of the petals and making sure that your strokes are really light and almost in circular motions. They don't look like you're scribbling, because you won't be able to blend out those pencil strokes as easily, so you'll be able to see them in the end result if you're not careful in the beginning. Usually I block in the darkest areas first because it allows me to accurately fill in the midtones and the lighter areas. If I start with the midtones, they can seem really dark in comparison to the white of the paper, but then when I add the darkest tones, the midtones may end up being too light. So I find it easier to start with the darkest tones first, and that way I have the white of the paper and the darkest part, and I can easily judge the midtones in between. Whether you're using the coloured pencil or the graphite pencil, just make sure that you press really lightly with the pencil and build up your darker areas in layers. It's easier to remove the graphite if you've pressed really lightly, and it's easier to blend out your strokes for a smoother finish than if you pressed really hard to begin with. So I'm starting to fill in the midtones with the 2B Derwent Graphic pencil, and I'm switching between the black coloured pencil and this 2B pencil depending on how dark that area is going to be. And then I'm going back through and darkening up the darkest areas by overlapping the black pencil on top of the previous layer of black. In this first layer, I'm not too worried about the details. I'm mainly just blocking in the main shapes and the tones. Because I'm going to be blending out this layer, if I did actually put all the fine details in this layer, I will just be wasting my time because I'll blend out those details and you won't be able to see them, and then I'll have to redo them anyway. So I just keep it really simple in the first layer and just try and get my lights where they're supposed to be and my darks where they're supposed to be, and then worry about the details in the further layers. So now that I've got my darkest areas and my midtones down, I'm actually using that blending stump to blend out this first layer. And just make sure that even when you're using your blending stump, that you're following the direction of the petal. You don't want to go back and forth against the pencil strokes that you've made, because you'll blend it in that direction and it will look a little weird, like the petals have crisscross marks on them. So just make sure that you're always following the direction of the lines in the petal, whether you're using the pencil or you're blending it out with the blending stump. And going back to the black coloured pencil, the reason that I use it is because it's much darker than any graphite pencil that I've found, and I find that when I use graphite alone, I tend to press really hard in the areas that I want to be darker because the pencil is just not dark enough, and it creates that shiny effect, which I'm not really a fan of. So to stop this, I started using a coloured pencil that can be used lightly and is much darker. You can use a dark graphite pencil like an 8B or a 9B if you like as well, but just keep in mind that if you press harder to try and get it to be darker, it can create that shiny effect that some people don't really like. Once you've blended out the first layer, you can go back through and add another layer to start creating that depth and to fill in the tooth of the paper a bit more. So you can start to go back through with that black colored pencil in the darkest areas, and this time make sure that you're looking at your reference photo a little more closely and start to get in some of those finer details. And you can see that I'm still following the direction of the petal when I lay down my strokes. I'm curving the strokes over the curve of the petal to make it look more 3D than if I tried to do a straight line over the petal. It will make it look really flat. A rose or a flower is a really good starting project for a beginner because it has a mixture of shadows and highlights and smooth bits and detailed bits. It also has lots of curves and flat areas as well, and that gives you a bit of practice with a lot of different things. Also, if you get a petal wrong or you miss a petal altogether, you probably won't even notice in the end result, whereas if you started with an animal or a face and you got the proportions wrong, and then you will most likely notice that in the end result. Here I'm back with the 2B graphite pencil, and I'm adding more depth to the mid-tone areas, using the same process as the darkest areas, making sure that I'm following the curve of the petals and working really lightly. So I'm going through and blending out that second layer, but this time I'm using a cotton tip instead of the blending stump, and you can see it works pretty much exactly the same way. So if you don't have a blending stump laying around, you can just easily use a cotton tip instead. If you choose a reference photo that's in color, like this one, it was a red rose, change it to black and white on your computer or your phone to make it easier for yourself. Sometimes it can be hard to see the values in a photo that's in color, and it will be much easier if you just changed your photo to be black and white. When you do this, you can also hype up the contrast or change the brightness if you want to make it pop even more. So I will come back to the rose, but I'm going to start on the background. So I'm lightly laying down the pencil strokes in a diagonal direction, just going in one direction, making sure that you press very lightly, otherwise you'll be able to see those pencil strokes even after you've blended it out. So I'm going over the entire background like this. I'm aiming for a slightly darker corners and edges and then a lighter shade towards the flower. So I'm going back over the background doing the same thing but changing the direction of the strokes so it overlaps in the opposite direction. And this will help make the blending a little bit smoother. See how I'm holding the pencil at the end of my pencil, and I'm holding it really loosely on the side like this to stop myself from pressing too hard or creating dark strokes. It almost glides across the paper surface like this, whereas if you hold it really close to the pencil tip, you'll find that you end up doing harder strokes that are more precise, which is really great if you want to do fine details, but for a really smooth, light area like this, you want to hold it further back so it's lighter. And then I'm going back through with the black coloured pencil in the darkest areas, like in the corners. And if you don't know what that silver contraption on the end of my pencil is, it's actually a pencil extender, and it's really useful when your pencils get a bit too small to hold comfortably in your hand. And I'll leave a link to these in the description below, but most art stores carry them. And now I've got the cotton tip again, and I'm blending out those strokes to make it a little bit smoother. And you can see that I'm going in kind of a circular motion with the cotton tip, and this helps to make it look a little bit more smoother, like an out of focus background. Whereas if I went in a diagonal direction like I did with my pencil strokes, it's gonna show up those strokes. So it's not gonna look as smooth as if you overlapped these tiny little circles like I'm doing here. And the reason that I blend between layers is because it smooths out the pencil strokes, and it also pushes the pencil into the grooves or the tooth of the paper. And this allows more pencil to grip to the tooth of the paper for your following layers as well. If you're creating a really smooth subject like skin, you can blend out every layer that you do, so the pencil strokes are blended out in every layer. But if you're creating something textured like this rose or something with fur, you can blend out the first few layers and then only slightly blend the last layers, or don't blend them at all, so that your pencil strokes create the texture in the petals or the fur. So I'm going back and adding a second layer to the background, doing the same thing where I press really lightly and overlap the direction of the pencil. This second layer will help create a softer look because it will be filling more of the gaps in the tooth of the paper. A good tip when you're using graphite or charcoal or pastel is to rest your hand on a piece of paper, and this stops the oils from your hand getting onto the paper, and it also stops your hand from smudging your artwork. Just remember not to drag the paper across your work when you want to move it. Pick it up and place it back down so it doesn't smudge your work. So here I'm using the edge of my eraser to lighten up some of the widest bits on the rose because I got some excess graphite there when I was blending everything out. And it also helps if you just want to make the highlights even lighter to try and get them back to the white of the paper. So I'm using the black coloured pencil again to go back and darken up the darkest shadows, and this will help really make the drawing pop. When you're first starting out with art, or you're still in the beginning stages, I like to recommend starting with a black and white medium like graphite or charcoal, or if you really want to start with paint or pastels, then just start with black and white paints first. This way you take colour out of the equation, and all you need to worry about is getting your shadows dark enough and your highlights light enough. This allows you to spend more time learning how your pencils work or how your paints work, and it gives you a good feel of the medium before adding colour into the equation. Working in black and white is also a good way to practice getting your values right, and that's the most important part of working in realism. Values relate to how dark or light something is. You won't be able to find the perfect colour that is going to make something look more realistic, because that's not what makes a piece realistic. Colour is important, but values are even more important. That's why black and white artwork can still look amazingly realistic. A good tip to see if your darks are dark enough and your lights are light enough is to put your artwork next to your reference photo and compare them side by side. If you haven't printed a reference photo that's the same size as your artwork, you can take a photo of your work and compare them side by side with your reference photo on your phone or on your computer, and this will allow you to see the differences between the two a bit easier, and you can adjust your artwork accordingly. So my drawing looks a little bit grainy, and that's because of the type of paper that I chose. So if you don't like how this looks, or you're drawing a subject that needs a really smooth finish like skin, then I would recommend finding a really smooth surface like a hot pressed watercolor paper or a really smooth drawing paper instead, and that will help smooth out the pencil strokes a little bit better and stop having that grainy look that mine has. So now I'm starting to use the mechanical pencil to add in the smallest details and sharpen up some of the areas that I couldn't quite get sharp enough just with the normal graphite pencil or the coloured pencil. Mechanical pencils can be a great way to save in the cost of buying new pencils, because the lead in the mechanical pencil is always sharp, which means you use the entire lead instead of sharpening away your graphite pencils every time you need a sharp point. It's always sharp, so it also saves a lot of time as well. Another good tip when you're working in any medium that's on paper is to tape your work down. This way it stops your piece from sliding around, and it stops the corners from lifting up while you work. It also keeps it nice and flat. Another reason is that it gives you a nice clean border to hold on to when you're finished, and it makes it a bit easier to frame that way. Make sure that when you're measuring out the size of your artwork that you add the border size on top of the artwork size. For example, this is a 6" by 8" piece, so I would cut my paper so that it's 7" by 9", and that way I have a 1/2 inch border all the way around my piece. Also make sure that you're using acid-free tape that is low tack so it doesn't rip your paper when you remove it. Be careful and remove it really slowly at the end so you don't tear your paper. If you find that the tape is tearing your paper when you're trying to take it off, some people have told me that you can use a hairdryer on a really low setting just to loosen up the sticky part of the tape, and apparently it comes off quite a bit easier that way. I've not had this issue and I've not tried the hairdryer thing, but I have heard numerous people mention it, so if you're struggling with that, give it a shot. I've put together a playlist on the screen that has some other graphite and charcoal tutorials that I thought you might find helpful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.